Marshall here. Welcome back to the Realignment. Hey everyone, welcome back to the show. Today's episode is all about the sanctions placed on Russia after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I'm joined by Bloomberg's Stephanie Baker. She has a new book out, Punishing Putin, Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. This conversation is interesting because there's a bunch of questions that are open regarding sanctions. Are the sanctions working? Were they overhyped and overstated at the start of the war? And how is Russia actually performing given the status of the sanctions regime? And of course, domestic pressure at home in the West broadly when it comes to oil prices. There's also a broad conversation about how sanctions will in fact deter, or maybe not deter, China from making moves when it comes to Taiwan. Lots of great stuff. Really recommend the book. Lots of high value insights per minute here. So really appreciate you all for joining me on the show. Huge thank you to the Foundation for American Innovation for supporting the work of this podcast. Stephanie Baker, welcome to the Realignment.
Thanks for having me.
To have this conversation, we have to talk about a concept that has become increasingly relevant of late, but probably wasn't the main focus of folks' attention during the global war on terror. What is economic statecraft?
Ooh, that encompasses a lot of things, but you're right to date it back to sort of 9/11 and the fight on terror. It's using financial tools for a political end, often in face of a security threat. So the Bush administration widened the use of these financial tools to try to track down and stop financial flows to terrorists. That then expanded from there quite dramatically through expanded sanctions against Iran and then Venezuela. Of course, there had been existing sanctions for years against dictatorships like North Korea or Cuba. But my argument in the book that I've written is that the sanctions that were imposed against Russia in 2022, starting in 2022, were on a completely different scale and were essentially a grand experiment in how far you could push the concept of economic statecraft. Never before has a country as large as Russia or an economy as integrated in the global financial system been targeted by such an expansive array of sanctions. Under that is asset blocks, asset freezes, and travel bans for individuals, blocking companies from for the U.S. from the U.S. financial system, export controls, trade restrictions. Everything under that umbrella would be considered tools to be used as part of economic statecraft. And I think we're seeing it being used in a completely different way with Russia, because when Putin invaded Ukraine, the response really shifted into the economic sphere because the West did not want to risk a military confrontation with a nuclear power. And that's why the battle quickly shifted to the economic sphere. And that's still playing out. I think there have been lessons learned, and we can talk about that later. But there's still tinkering going on as to how the West, the collective Europe, UK, the US, Japan, how they can work together to try to limit Putin's revenues to finance his war.
What's interesting is, as you know in the book, this isn't the first time we've leveled sanctions against Russia related to Ukraine. Obviously, when Russia seizes Crimea in 2014, sanctions were put in place. They weren't particularly effective. What differentiates the sanctions in 2022 from the sanctions in 2014?
Right. The sanctions in 2014, going back to Putin's annexation of Crimea, it was the first violation, Putin's violations of Ukraine's borders, but the response was very weak. I think there was concern in Europe that Europe was still suffering from the debt crisis. The economies were fragile. I think even in the U.S., there was a sense that the economic recovery from the financial crisis in 2008 was still somewhat fragile. So the Obama administration in particular was reluctant to do anything radical that could upset the financial equilibrium. And his administration pursued these pinprick sanctions, which again was very innovative in terms of how they were trying to think about using the tools of economic statecraft in a way that would try to harm Russia without harming the US or Europe. Of course, Europe was quite reluctant to pursue sanctions. Europe has traditionally been much more tied to the Russian economy. But what the U.S. pursued were these debt and equity restrictions against big Russian companies. In other words, blocking their ability to raise financing, debt or equity financing in the West. And Europe followed to some degree. I think the turning point was the shooting down of MH17 over Ukraine with the Dutch passenger plane, which helped turn the Dutch into turn them from sanction skeptics into, sanction advocates in a way that I don't think would have happened. But it still did not really force Europe and the US to pursue really aggressive measures like we saw in 2022. There were no full-scale blocking of Russian banks. The banks that were targeted were quite small, relatively speaking. And of course, Europe was still very dependent on Russian energy. And in fact, after 2014, Europe became even more dependent on Russian energy as Russia raced to complete this the second Nord Stream gas pipeline bypassing Ukraine.
Something I'm curious about, was interesting about the 2022 sanctions, is they actually perfectly coincided with a pretty intense debate in the academic community and the financial community about the overall effectiveness of economic sanctions in the first place, especially as we've handled them post-Cold War, everything from the aftermath of Desert Storm to North Korea, Iran, etc. How do you understand what we did in 2022 in the context of that debate over whether or not sanctions at all are effective in actually achieving the goals? Because I think we should understand sanctions as a tool that we use to accomplish some X, Y, or Z objective.
Right. It's a good question. And I think it's important to look at Russia as different from some of those other examples that people give. Cuba and North Korea in particular, these were long-standing sanctions programs against state-led economies, essentially, that were small players on the global sphere. I think in the 2022 sanctions, you need to define what quote-unquote working means. Clearly, if you define working as did they force Putin to withdraw his troops from Ukraine, then they're not working. But if you define working as have they imposed meaningful costs on the Russian economy, then yes, they are working on that level. And I think that's what makes the Russia case different is these are sanctions imposed against a country in response to an invasion of its neighbor and a violation of the UN Charter. And one of the key goals of the sanctions was to undermine Putin's ability to finance the war. Now, I argue in the book that unfortunately they started strong in 2022, right after the invasion. Right after the invasion ended up being on the upper scale of expectations. There was some belief in some circles that maybe Putin would just sort of push out from the Donbass. Instead, he went straight for trying to take Kiev. And I think when you look at the sanctions, how they are being targeted specifically to make it harder for Putin to finance his war. One of the biggest challenges that they came up against was oil. Now, oil has always been the mainstay of the Russian economy going back to the 80s. It was one of the reasons why the Soviet economy started crumbling in the mid-80s, and that led to glasnost and perestroika. In the 90s, the price of Russian oil was very low. That led to economic weakness and political instability under Boris Yeltsin. But then Putin enjoyed this relatively high price for oil over the course of his presidency, and he used that to finance modernization of his military. The problem that happened when Putin invaded was that there was a global panic over oil supplies and a general pullback from wanting to touch anything to do with Russian oil, and that caused oil prices to spike. And ironically, that allowed Putin to profit from his own war because Russia was making record sums from selling oil. And when Europe tried to, after the atrocities in Bucha came to light, many leaders in Europe decided that enough was enough. They had held back on touching energy because of their reliance, but they pushed forward with this idea of an EU embargo on Russian oil. That then forced the Biden administration officials to panic because they were worried that that would cause Russia to withhold oil from global markets, which would cause a massive spike in global oil prices and spark potentially a global recession, and higher prices at the pump just ahead of crucial midterm elections. And that's when they came up with this very out-of-the-box idea to try to cap the price of Russian oil. Something like this had never been tried before. This is against such a major energy exporter. And the idea that they came up with after months of negotiation was to bar U.S. Western services, primarily insurance, for Russian oil unless it was sold below $60 a barrel. And for a few months that worked, and Russia's oil revenues did drop. But then Russia developed this shadow fleet of rusty oil tankers to transport oil outside of Western services, outside of Western insurance, to new markets, namely China, and to the surprise of many, India, which went from importing something like 1% of its oil from Russia to 40%. And so you had this massive reshuffling of global oil supplies, but the U.S. in particular, I think, was reluctant to really enforce that policy, and it didn't really go after Russia's shadow fleet, which enabled Putin to continue earning petrodollars. And it was, I think, it's one of the many signs of the Biden administration being too cautious and too worried about blowback. They remained very, very worried about prices for gasoline at the pump in the United States. It was a politically salient issue. But it remains the main source of revenue for Putin. If Russia's oil revenues drop even 10, 20%, that will have a huge impact on his revenues and his ability to finance defense spending.
Something I'm curious about, and this is where I'll speak for the Biden administration here, I think the difficulty is every week that the war goes on, it's harder to argue that those sacrifices in terms of inflation politics in the US, the price of gas, et cetera, are going to make sense, because with every single week, it's less and less clear that the sanctions program is going to be the determining factor in the actual conflict. So it's one thing to say, hey, look, we're going to sacrifice because, Kyiv is being stormed. It's the middle of February. We're now in March, April, May. Okay, now Putin's pulling back. We're going to put the pressure on. But it's hard to imagine a world politically where we could say to ourselves, hey, it's February 2024. This extra pressure on gas is going to be the straw that breaks the camel's back when it comes to Russia's war economy. So how do you think about that dynamic of it's just harder and harder and harder to sustain the engagement and the attention the longer this drags on?
Look, I understand the reluctance and the caution from the Biden administration. They need to be able to sell this policy at home and make sure that it is not. One of the crucial tenets of sanctions is you try to hit your target harder than you hit yourself. In other words, the principle of statecraft is you don't want to cause economic pain at home by adopting any of these sanctions. I understand that, but if you think about the counterfactual, what happens if you just say lift all these restrictions on Russian oil? That's only going to allow Putin to earn more revenue, to build more missiles, to build, to make more artillery to attack Ukraine. So I think it's the very least we can do. And there's a lot of talk about sanctions that, they're overused because they're seen as a cost-free tool. Mm-hmm. You never really have to say you're sorry for sanctions. It's hard to really assess the impact at home. And I think, certainly with the real reshuffling of global oil trade, arguably, I think the impact of these restrictions are minimal on consumers in the U.S. and Europe. But I think it's important to understand that Putin is feeling under pressure economically. Sanctions by nature take time to build pressure because inevitably, they introduce distortions. The Russians figure out ways to get around them. Then there's the response from the U.S. and Europe to try to close down loopholes or evasion networks. But at this point, if you look at the Russian economy, it is beginning to feel pressure. It's expected widely to slow quite dramatically by the end of the year and into next year. Very high, persistent high inflation, like 9%, high interest rates to try to cool the economy, to try to cool prices. Putin needs some breathing room. And that's why he keeps talking about potential, negotiations. Part of what I was trying to argue in my book, when I said I was writing a book on sanctions, I got a lot of people telling me, "Oh, well, they don't work. Why should we bother?" That is a page out of Putin's propaganda. He wants us to believe that they're not working, and that therefore we should just give up, because he does want sanctions relief. If you look at it from any measure, whether it's capital flight or the cost of his, building his shadow fleet of oil tankers, to the higher prices he has to pay for semiconductors that he imports from middlemen in China and Hong Kong that are powering his defense industries, that they desperately need to make these precision-guided missiles that they launch at Ukraine. Those are all costing him more money. And anything that can slow him down or create friction in his ability to wage war is worth doing. I personally think that the Biden administration should be stronger and the way it's approached some of these things. I think they've tiptoed around a number of issues in ways that I don't think would have sort of blowback on voters in the United States.
What are some of those ways? So we focused on the oil example, and that's a very useful one because it gets at the core of when you're not sanctioning autarkic, irrelevant from the global economy regimes like North Korea and Cuba, there's literally not going to be a cost there beyond the moral debate about like U.S. policy towards those countries. But the oil example is a perfect one because it shows there is a very specific cost in the West specifically. What are examples that don't quite fall into that oil one that you just referenced then?
Well, the one I referenced just briefly was the issue of semiconductors being shipped via middlemen in Hong Kong and China to Russia for its defense industry. Washington threatened to impose in December sanctions on financial institutions that facilitate the flow of goods to Russia's defense industry. And that did spook many Chinese banks in particular. They then widened that definition this summer of who they would target with secondary sanctions if they did business with sanctioned Russian entities, and that has had a dramatic effect. You see a shortage of Chinese yuan in Russia as Chinese banks become worried about being sanctioned by Washington. They don't want to be cut off from the U.S. dollar because the amount of trade they do with Russia is relatively small in the greater scheme of things, compared to the amount of trade that they do with the rest of the world. I think that the administration could impose sanctions on a Chinese bank as a sort of demonstration act to scare other banks from doing business with Russia. And that would really shut down that trade in a real way. That's just one example. In a way, that's a very targeted move, very much focused on Russia's ability to build tanks, missiles, what have you. They need to continue attacking Ukraine because the fact of the matter is Russia has burned through huge stockpiles of Soviet-era and missiles, and the missiles that they're firing at Ukraine, from my reporting, are fresh. They've been recently built, so making it harder for Russia to import what it needs for its defense industry, I think, is a key plank in the economic war.
From a reporter's perspective, then, what explains the reluctance to take that policy you just suggested of a demonstration on a Chinese bank? Like, why? Because if we're thinking to stories, because politics is about stories and narratives, and the example I'd give is that partially a huge reason why there's been so much support for U.S. and allied aid to Ukraine is we have examples of, okay, wow, like we're seeing Russian tanks just get knocked out in the first few months of the war because of like allied aid. That's obviously very, very effective. And one of the stories that caught a lot of fire was like very quickly, there were reports that the Russians were having to cannibalize microwaves and dishwashers because of the lack of chips they had. Given that story, like, why wouldn't you just do this demonstration effect you described? Like, what's the thinking within the administration?
I think they're treading very carefully when it comes to relations with China. I think there's a reluctance to really amp up confrontation with China in that way, and they think that they can use, persuasion, diplomacy to try to scare, and threats to try to scare them away from doing this business without going all the way and imposing sanctions in a way that I think would really ramp up tensions. There's already concern in some quarters that the war and the sanctions have driven Russia and China closer together. I think that's somewhat misplaced. I think that they were already allied. And if you remember, Putin went to China at the end of the Olympics and they announced their no limits partnership. So they were already well on their way. I don't necessarily think that the sanctions have driven them closer together. I actually think the sanctions potentially could drive a wedge between them if they were applied effectively, by forcing China to choose. Do you want to do business with Russia, which is, roughly the size, an economy roughly the size of Italy, or do you want to do business with the rest of the world, i.e. the sanctions coalition, which is, half of the world's GDP, US, Europe, UK, and Japan. And I think in that way, if they force China to choose, it would actually undermine that partnership. Jake Sullivan went to China recently. I think there's concern about, issues of, China potentially invading or blockading Taiwan. Obviously, the sanctions against Russia are kind of about showing China what they could face if they pursue such a strategy of either blockading or invading Taiwan. But I also think they show the limits of economic statecraft. I don't think the U.S. could pursue a similar strategy, similarly aggressive economic isolation strategy for China, because the world is far too dependent on China. I mean, a third of global manufacturing capacity is in China. Obviously, the pandemic has forced many economies to diversify, but still, there's absolutely no way that a similar coalition, Europe, U.S., Japan, could try to isolate China economically as a form of punishment for any action on Taiwan, like they have tried to do with Russia. I think it would be very economically damaging.
Something I'm curious about, the title of the book actually gets at what I think to be the central issue here, which is the title is Punishing Putin. To what degree are sanctions being used as a form of post-op punishment versus something that actually deters or determines actions on the battlefield or at peace negotiations? Because we obviously, I think, should trumpet the examples of oligarchic super yachts taken as a part of a sanctions policy, but it's hard to imagine beyond punishing folks attached to the regime, that's ultimately the determinant of actual Russian policy as a whole. So how should we understand the mix of we're punishing because bad behavior should receive a negative effect from, okay, the yachts are actually the determinant for Russia's actual approach to Ukraine and to the West broadly?
Yeah, look, I mean, sanctions are supposed to bring about behavior change. And I think in this case, they haven't worked that way. And there was a lot of discussion in the run-up to the invasion when we were getting all that intelligence about the Russian troop buildup and would he or would he not invade. There was debate amongst the G7 leaders of, do we show our hand? Or is it better to have a certain degree of strategic ambiguity about what we might do collectively? There were a series of warnings that the economic price Russia would pay would be incredibly high, unlike anything Putin had ever seen before. That did not provide an effective deterrence. And I think there's a real question as to whether or not, had they imposed aggressive sanctions ahead of time before Putin actually invaded, would that have deterred him? Would that have actually forced him to continue? Politically forced him, into a corner at home. I think he was intent on invading regardless. I'm not sure the sanctions would have swayed him in the end, one way or another. So I think the more effective way of looking at sanctions now are, to what degree are they slowing him down? Mm-hmm. To what degree are they degrading his capacity to wage war through defense, spending, through being able to shower bonuses on Russians who sign up to serve in Ukraine? He's offered these incredible bonuses to try to lure people into his meat grinder in Ukraine. And then secondly, can you use Russian assets for Ukraine? Can you use sanctioned Russian assets for Ukraine? And of course, the big debate on that, the biggest pot of money at stake is this roughly $300 billion pot of Russian central bank reserves, which they froze within days of the invasion, which was really probably the most radical move that they took in terms of economic statecraft. There was debate and division over that, but now there's a big debate over how do you leverage those assets? How do you potentially use all of them to help Ukraine? Why should Western taxpayers be financing this war? We've got all this Russian money available, and there's been huge divisions. Most of the money, through a quirk of Putin's policy of shielding himself from the dollar and concern about future sanctions from Washington, Putin moved a lot of those central bank reserves into Europe. There's a lot of division in Europe and opposition to going ahead and actually seizing the whole pot of money. And what they're doing now is trying to use it as a pot to borrow against. Basically, you're going to use the interest payments from that pot of money, that $300 billion, to raise a loan of as big as $50 billion to help Ukraine. The problem is Ukraine needs a lot more money than that for the foreseeable future. There are other frozen Russian assets that the Justice Department, for instance, is going after, super yachts being one of them. Can those be leveraged and forfeited on the basis of criminal indictments for sanctions evasion? Could those assets be forfeited and sold with the proceeds going to Ukraine? I think that's a more effective use of the sanctions, but it's proving to be equally difficult. They're going through U.S. courts, which I think is a good thing. There's a rule of law that's being followed. There's a judge overseeing these. It's not being these assets aren't just being seized, unlike the way Putin has acted against Western companies in Russia, where he has just outright seized assets without any kind of court proceeding or public forum. So I think it's less about trying to change Putin's behavior and more about trying to make it harder for him to sustain the war.
This isn't quite a counterfactual because those are never fun, but I think this would be really helpful in terms of understanding the issue here. So given the heated rhetoric politically that accompanied the launching of the sanctions, it'd be easy to say, okay, this just wasn't a financial nuclear weapon in the ways that we kind of saw from a rhetorical perspective. Therefore, the sanctions aren't working. Therefore, we should pursue a different policy. But I think the better way to conceive of this, and you've hinted at this, is what would this war, or what could this war look like if Russia were not at all financially encumbered by the sanctions we've put in place so far? So to the degree you can, given your reporting, I've appreciated how, to the facts you've stuck here, what would Russia's economic capabilities be if they didn't have to face the past 3 years of sanctions effectively?
Right. Well, I mean, the sanctions have cost Russia hundreds of billions of dollars. Not just the Russian central bank reserves that were frozen and are hindering Russia's ability to stabilize its currency, but also, all the assets that were frozen the price cap, as leaky and as ineffectual as it's been, has still cost Russia something like $80 billion, according to one estimate. I think without any constraints, he could have probably moved further into Ukraine and taken more territory. I think his defense industry would be much healthier and be able to produce even more than it has. And I think the Russian economy would not be suffering as high inflation as it is now. Now, there's Putin's spending on the war, both the huge payments he's giving to soldiers to sign up, as well as, money that he's showered, record defense spending, has put the economy on a war footing. It's caused high inflation. But the fact of the matter is they have imports. Russia's exports have dropped, and its imports have dropped. Sanctions are contributing to the high inflation that Russia is suffering. So I do think a Russia unleashed without any economic constraints would have a much easier time trying to take Ukraine and would be able to build up its defense industry much more easily.
I wonder, and given the fact that sanctions have been imposed on autocratic, non-democratic regimes since the post-war period, I'd be curious whether you think at the end of the day, everything you're just suggesting here or discussing suggests that democracies would just be so much more vulnerable to economic pressure in this case. So, for example, let's say the U.S. were to pursue a war of choice as Ukraine is for Russia, as an invasion of Taiwan would be for China, and we suffered the economic consequences that you're describing for Russia, very quickly, you'd see incredible amounts of pushback. You could see the party that led the White House and Congress suffer horrible midterms. You could see a president not be reelected, but it just seems that Putin just has such a long timeline. She would have such a long timeline. How do you just think about that issue of whether or not this is just a playbook that just in the short to medium term just isn't as effective when there's such autocratic power? And at the end of the day, there are these costs, but without the real democratic pushback, there's not going to be an actual means of translating that popular discontent into a shift in policy.
Right. And I think what you're trying to get at is, I think, a notion that is debated within the sanctions world, which is, are the sanctions designed for regime change? Which they officially say they're not, of course. But in effect, they really are, because the war is never going to end unless Putin's out of power. There's no way, right? Conceivably, it will, we can talk about that a bit more, but, whether or not they could agree a ceasefire along the current lines of control, perhaps. But I agree that Putin's grip on media, his repressive regime, the fact that he throws people in jail for the slightest, giving $10 to Ukrainian charity, people are in jail for years in Russia for the slightest sign of opposition, that it's very hard to use sanctions as a way of putting pressure on Russians at large to therefore become economically discontent and rise up against their leader. I think that's very hard, particularly because the oil revenue is cushioning everything at the moment. And unless the global price of oil drops significantly, Russia won't really feel that much economic pain. Of course, things are getting worse. The economy is slowing down. Putin's ability to shower Russian consumers with higher wages or subsidized mortgages, which he's done, he has had to stop doing that, it becomes more difficult. But I think that's the misconception of sanctions, is that, at least in this case, I think it's unrealistic to think that the sanctions would, apply pressure on Russian billionaires who've had their assets frozen in the West to then rise up and replace Putin, or put pressure on ordinary Russians to rise up against Putin. But they do undermine his credibility. And the central plank of Putin's credibility since he took power was, after the chaos of the 1990s, his deal was, you support me and I give you economic stability in return. And the past few months, at the very least, if not year, that economic stability has seemed a bit shaky. It's not quite as clear that agreement, that deal that he implicitly struck with the Russian populace is holding or can hold. So I think it would be a mistake to assume that just because he's got a very strong grip on the media and has a repressive regime and therefore it looks like he's, going to be there for a while, to assume that the regime is not fragile. I think it is fragile. I do think that the sanctions do work alongside the military aid to Ukraine. I don't think you can think of one operating in isolation with the other. So you think about the economic impact of the sanctions, coupled with the Ukrainian incursion in Kursk, which has displaced some couple 100,000 Russians who had to evacuate, bringing the war home in a real way. Those things work in tandem, I think, to raise questions amongst Russians like, wait a minute, why are we doing this?
So before we get to the last section, I want to make reference then to the political rhetoric that was attached to the imposition of sanctions. This wasn't just the Biden administration. This was, if you read the reporting in February, talk of the unprecedented nature, you helpfully used the term experiment. I don't think the term experiment was used as much then. It was just really about how, because the invasion took everyone by surprise. And then B, what also took people by surprise was how aggressive the Western response was following. That said, do you worry that the rhetoric, the results of the experiment was still too far away from this rhetoric, that now if you're China, if you're Russia, the narrative you could take away from this is, okay, that's bad. 9% inflation isn't great. We're really struggling on a war footing here. But from a Maslow's hierarchy of needs perspective, we've survived it. We're moving forward. We have this national objective. This can now just be priced in. So my takeaway would just be, if you're China, you would think to yourself, look, if we decide it's worth it to go for Taiwan, there are going to be some forms of serious economic response, but we'll just price that in, because Russia has proven that A, countries are more resilient in a deglobalizing world than you'd think they were, and B, there are always different vulnerabilities, both within the financial system, but also within the Western alliance. It's not at all guaranteed that the Europeans would join in any serious sanctions regime in the Indo-Pacific towards China if there was an invasion. The US and Japan, South Korea, Australia would have their own pressures. How do you just think about this overall in terms of the gap between rhetoric and just the fact that you can maybe just price that in if the results just aren't quite as intense as one would think?
Yeah, it's true that at the beginning of the war, there was this overly optimistic prediction, because they had never gone this far with sanctions, that this would really bring the Russian economy to its knees. And in the first month or so, it did cause havoc. The ruble crashed. It did look quite bleak, but then Russia recovered on the back again of oil revenue. I think that there is I agree that there's some degree of, okay, we've seen how this movie plays out, and we think we can adapt. We know what they might go after. But I think it's still a huge price to pay. I think it would cause China to pause and think about how a potential invasion of Taiwan would play out. And of course, with Taiwan, we have a completely different flashpoint, which is the semiconductor industry, and how that would play out. We don't know how that would play out, actually. So yes, they've priced it in, but I think China is very different in terms of how it would play out, because the Chinese economy and its role in the global economy is quite different. I don't think, unfortunately, what you have is a growing coalition between China, Russia, and Iran cooperating together because of their opposition to this US-led, US-dominated global order. And that's the only sort of ideological thing that ties them together. There's very little else. There's no, I did say this is sort of a new Cold War. We're starting a new chapter, but the real difference between the old Cold War and the new Cold War is it's not as ideological as the old one was. And of course, Russia is the junior partner to China. It's very dependent. China's the major power and is leading in that, and potentially could provide some sort of form of restraint against Russia. But I do think that is a danger of a potential unintended consequence that it deepens this Cold War rift. Go ahead.
And I think this gets at why the Cold War, because obviously there's a lot of debate, both publicly and like privately in the academy and like the foreign policy community around whether or not the Cold War II is this a Cold War. But I think it's helpful at a narrative level, because the point of the first Cold War is it split the world into two different worlds. We did not seriously trade with the Soviet Union. We did not trade with communist China until the late 1970s, 1980s, when, Deng Xiaoping did his systemic reforms. So I think what makes this so difficult, and I think frightening from my perspective, is, and this is why the priced-in debate really matters, the operating assumption within all the different players from a governmental perspective is we're just not going back to the 1990s or 2000s. And we just need to accept that in all of our analysis. Because it's one thing to say to yourself, if you're Russia, look, we can't sustain this economic harm. Things really were looking more optimistic in the 1990s or even some parts of the 2000s. Let's just go back to that. But if you can't go back to that, it's just going to change your set of operating assumptions. So my question to you, before one big question about Russia, and we'll take us out of this episode, to what degree are you optimistic or pessimistic, depending on your perspective, on the whole deglobalization narrative? Are there just going to operationally be separate economic spheres that then obviously shift the dynamics that really undergirded peace after the Cold War?
Yeah, it's such a big issue. As I'm sort of a post-Cold War child, spent time in Eastern Europe and Russia in the 1990s, and watched this whole debate play out, this whole trade that if you could develop an economy, help Eastern Europe and Russia transition away from a command economy to a market economy, democracy would follow. And, the whole Thomas Friedman peace theory, McDonald's peace theory that, any country that was developed enough to have a McDonald's wouldn't go to war. Well, Putin sort of blew up that whole theory, showed how wrong it was. And I think one of the problems with the U.S. approach to Russia in the 90s is that it focused too much on the economy and not on democratic institutions. And that left Russia in a very vulnerable position because developing a market economy ended up being this corrupt crony capitalism rather than, and that did not foster democracy. But now, yes, I do see this accelerated deglobalization that we that got started in the 1990s and continued into the 2000s. And I think that will only deepen. I think that was reinforced by the pandemic. I think there's going to be a greater emphasis on trading with allies who have similar values, sort of a value-based trading relationship. Of course, this all depends if Trump gets in, if he wins a second term, that's a completely other debate. But I think that there will be an emphasis on trading with allies, trying to bring home production, to home, and a focus on the risks of relying on authoritarian economies like China and Russia. That we need to pull back from that to the greatest extent possible.
So, second to last question here, I would be curious then, if we're looking, as everyone is in these categories, towards deterring a conflict with China over Taiwan, key part of the sanctions story is if you're having to impose the sanctions, a couple of disasters have already happened before then. You haven't deterred the invasion. The Russians were convinced they could achieve victory in some degree. They were confident in their ability for their oil reserves to sort of bulwark their economy. So looking forward, if we're looking at the Indo-Pacific, if we're looking at China and the US, what should we be doing so that the relevant deterrences or even the relevant setups are there in the first place so that we wouldn't have to use these sanctions in the first place?
I mean, on one level, making sure that Ukraine doesn't lose is one way to make sure that China doesn't go ahead. I think that if Russia wins in Ukraine, if Russia manages to take more of Ukraine and Putin's invasion is somehow seen as a victory and the West caves by just drawing lines of control where Putin wants them and lifting some sanctions, then I think that will be viewed as license for China to do what it wants with Taiwan. I think that's absolutely crucial, and that's why I think Ukraine is much bigger than just Ukraine. I think the future of Ukraine matters to the world in a way that's it's not just a European issue. I think it has implications for the global order. And I think that, like I said before, I think that the way that the sanctions have been rolled out, even though I think that they could be tougher, I think do serve as a warning to China that this would not be a cost-free move on their part, that there would be serious costs involved. Obviously, there would be limits because of the nature of China's role in the global economy and how central it is as a manufacturing hub. But that this would be a costly venture, and is that really what they want?
So here is how we'll close out. I was really compelled by the fact that you started your journalistic career in the 1990s during the more optimistic part of the West's post-Cold War relationship with Russia. I think the reason why this Ukraine war has been so beyond just the battlefield and the questions about a war in Europe after World War II is this gets to the core of the question of like, what is Russia in the 21st century? Like, what's its purpose? What's its narrative? Should we be optimistic? Should we be pessimistic? How has writing this book, the journalism you do at Bloomberg, and then frankly, just your experiences in Russia when people were optimistic influenced your optimism or pessimism about the West able to find a stable and peaceful relationship with Russia in the 21st century?
I'm pretty pessimistic, if I'm honest. I just don't see a way out for Russia, short of the only way for Russia to re-enter the sort of global sphere. Remember, it was once a member of the G8. We expanded the G7 to include Russia to make it the G8. I think the only way for Russia to really re-enter the international community on any level would be full reparations for Ukraine and a just peace that is acceptable for Ukrainians, whatever that be. And what the Ukrainians want now is for Russians to get out of all of their territory, including Crimea. And I think militarily that looks really difficult to imagine at this point on the ground. I think politically for Russia to accept that kind of defeat at home, given the Russian mentality, I think politically would be very difficult. So I am quite pessimistic about Russia long term. I had it was such an amazing experience to watch Russia transform in the 1990s. There were huge problems. There was massive poverty. There was just crony capitalism. People on the take, fixed auctions for state assets, etc. But there was still a sense that, oh, well, they'll work it out. They'll find their way through. And it's so clear to me now that that era is over and Russia can never go back. I don't think I can go back to Russia anytime soon. I wouldn't feel comfortable. I mean, I felt more comfortable going to Ukraine in June than I did not want to go to Russia in the current environment. I just didn't think it was safe because of, that so many people have been just taken by the security services and put in jail for no reason. So I am quite pessimistic. I don't see how it will take a long time for the the situation in Ukraine to be resolved. And I don't see, without Putin at the helm, I think he has to leave in order for any kind of just peace to be agreed. But even if he does leave, I think that's going to be very difficult even for his successor. And I think there's a naive belief that anyone that comes after him might be more Western leaning or open to a deal. And, we could face actually someone that's even more of a hardliner. And that the idea of a kind of moderate leader emerging in Russia could take many, many years to come to fruition.
And that's why I led the question by just pointing out so much of this is really about Russia coming to terms with itself in terms of what is Russia? What is Russia's function in the international system? What does the West owe to Russia? Big questions, which we won't answer today, but I think should be on the top of everyone's minds. Stephanie, this has been really great. The book is Punishing Putin: Inside the Global Economic War to Bring Down Russia. Thanks for joining me on The Realignment.
Thanks for having me.